Hello and welcome. In this episode of London Transport Buses, we will be looking at the RT class double-decker bus. Now, it's fair to say that the RT has been somewhat eclipsed by its successor, the Routemaster. The Routemaster is without doubt the bus that everybody knows by name, and any half-cab front-engine bus with a rear platform stands the risk of being branded a Routemaster. And at certain shows, I've heard families, non-bus people, shall we say, refer to the RTs as older Routemasters. However, quite possibly without the RT, there probably wouldn't have been a Routemaster. And in the history of London Transport's vehicles, you certainly couldn't leave out the RT. RT buses dominated London's red and green fleets during the 1950s, the 60s, and into the 1970s. So come with me as we go back in time to explore the history of the London Transport RT bus. But before we begin, I would just like to say that this episode will solely be about the RT class buses. The similar Leyland RTLs and the wider RTWs, and indeed the low height RLHs, will feature in their own separate episode. So what exactly does RT stand for? Some have said it stands for Regent Type, whilst others have said it stands for Regent III. My personal opinion is that it's for Regent Type, but what do you think? What do you think RT stands for? The chassis of RT1 was completed at AEC in June 1938. However, the bodywork was being built separately at Chiswick. And at the time of the chassis completion, it was not ready. So this pioneer chassis was fitted and, I suppose you could say, disguised by a 1932 56-seat Dodson body with outside staircase. Now, this might sound a strange thing to do, but the mechanical units and the chassis of the RT needed to be tested in service. So it needed a body that could carry passengers and work on regular bus services. This combination was numbered ST1140 and entered service on the 13th of July 1938 at Hanwell Garage, which later would actually become Southall Garage. It was that close to the AEC works, but then the chaps at AEC would probably want it close at hand so they could keep an eye on it. It was in service for just under 6 months in this condition and was withdrawn on the 31st of December 1938. The body was removed and scrapped in April 1939. Chiswick had finally finished RT1's proper bodywork and it was ready to be fitted. RT1 was shown off to the public for the first time on the 13th of July 1939. And it's fair to say that it caused a bit of a sensation as it was quite different from anything else that had been seen before and was so ultra modern looking compared to what had come before it. Firstly, it was metal framed. All other double-deckers that had been built at Chiswick were timber framed. And it was the first London Transport bus to have an all-enclosed cab featuring a cab door. The only other vehicles that had doors at this time were the trolley buses. In its new guise, RT1 entered service from Chelverton Road, Putney on the 9th of August 1939. And it would turn out that this garage and neighbouring Putney Bridge would be the garages that would receive the first production vehicles. A total of 338 chassis were ordered, along with, unsurprisingly, 338 bodies. However, there would also be 3 extra bodies to act as floats when the buses came through for maintenance and overhaul. The production RTs were known as RT2s, and there were minor detail differences on the outside between these and RT1, the prototype bus. However, one main difference, which was under the skin of the RT2s, was that they were actually wooden framed. And whilst the rear end had been self-supporting on RT1, on the production RTs, it wasn't. But this did make them lighter. However, they were prone to sagging and didn't have as long lives as the metal-framed RT1 in the latter years. Now, one of the reasons these were wooden-framed was that Chiswick was simply not equipped to mass-produce metal-framed bodywork, being used to producing wooden-framed buses. Now, these are commonly known as pre-war RTs. However, despite being ordered in 1938, the time they were delivered, the war had actually started, as the first two RT-15 and RT-23 were delivered on the 13th of October 1939. Now, the 338 chassis had been ordered in batches of 150 and 188, so there was two batches to make up the order. And the first members of the first batch entered service on the 2nd of January 1940, and they entered service on routes 28, 30, 37 and 72. The last bus of the first batch, RT151, wasn't delivered until the 1st of February 1942. And by that time, with the war raging, there were severe restrictions on what could be built with what materials. And these restrictions prevented the second batch of 188 buses from being built. The production RTs proved to be very popular, apart from one issue that reared its head, which was the braking system. They were fitted with air brakes, and these were proving to be rather inadequate and would have to be modified. However, as you can imagine, in the middle of a big conflict like World War II, trying to find parts for bus brakes was pretty much non-existent. And this resulted in the fleet being withdrawn on the 1st of August 1940, with some of the buses being used as mess rooms for the Home Guard. As parts were sourced and fitted to the buses, they started to re-enter service again. But the braking system problem wasn't fully sorted out until towards the end of the war. Now, amazingly, AEC were anxious to try and sell the RT to other operators because it had been quite expensive to develop such an advanced bus, and they wanted to recoup some of that money. So in the early years of the war, February 1940, RT-19 was selected to become a demonstrator vehicle, and it set off on a tour around the country trying to win orders for the type. It returned in August 1942, sadly without any orders from any of the operators it visited. But by this time, bus building was largely limited to wartime austerity designs, whilst the workshops of Chiswick was switched to aircraft production. The 151 RTs survived the war with none totally written off by enemy action, although there were several damaged. RTs 59, 66, 97 and 110 were the vehicles that were affected by enemy action, with RTs 59 and 97 being so damaged they were sent to Birmingham to be repaired by Birmingham City Transport. When RT 110 was repaired, it had lost its front roof box, and this was to lead the way on the roof box being omitted from the future production RT buses. The RT2s were withdrawn at the end of 1955, with the first 17 being disposed of in December of 1955. By that time, the wooden frame bodywork was starting to show its age, but despite this, they were still mechanically sound, with the AEC units proving that they still had a fair amount of life left in them. This resulted in London Transport deciding to place the rest of them in service as staff buses or driver training buses, with the last RT2 training bus being withdrawn on the 13th of February 1963, and this was green liveried RT79. Towards the end of the war, London Transport again started drawing up plans for standardisation of its double-decker fleet, and this of course would involve the continuation of building RT-type buses. In April 1944, AEC signed a deal with London Transport to produce 1,000 RT chassis as soon as the circumstances regarding the war would allow. The bodywork on these buses was originally due to have been built at Chiswick, but London Transport hastily abandoned this idea because the amount of buses they already had that would need overhaul and repair work following the enemy action and strain put on by the efforts of the war, coupled to the fact, as I mentioned before, that Chiswick didn't have the experience in building metal frame bodywork, made them a rather impractical choice. A deal was struck with two local bodybuilders who had previously built metal framed bodies for London Transport: Wayman of Addlestone in Surrey and Park Royal of London NW10. Each would make an initial 250 bodies. These post-war RTs would be designated RT3 types, and there were a few detailed differences between those and the wartime RTs. Namely, the driver's cab window sloped down on the wartime buses, where it remained straight on the post-war buses. However, these buses had more in common with RT1, as that was metal framed and had a self-supporting rear platform and staircase. As a result of them being metal framed, these buses were also heavier than the RT2s, and they were fitted with a 9.6 litre 6-cylinder AEC diesel engine, which drove through a pre-select gearbox. Now, there always seems to be some kind of confusion between semi-automatic and pre-select gearboxes. I'm no expert, but I will try and explain the difference in layman's terms. Semi-automatic is a gearbox that doesn't have a clutch, and in a bus, moving the gear selector in the cab normally results in a direct action in the gearbox, which selects the gear that was selected. It's a little bit confusing, but stick with it. A pre-select gearbox has a clutch valve, not a clutch pedal, a clutch valve, and this is dipped to engage the gear. So you can put it into first gear and it will stay in neutral until you dip that clutch valve button on the floor of the cab. So this means that you can be loading passengers and you can be ready to move off in first gear, but the bus is still in neutral. And as soon as the bell goes, you can press that clutch valve and the bus will drop into gear and you can pull away. Basically, it means that you can be in a gear ahead of the one that you actually need, and you're ready to change into that gear at any time. As soon as the bus has moved and pulled away in first gear, you can select second gear, but second gear won't work until you engage the clutch valve. It might sound quite complicated, but it kind of makes sense, and it's quite a good little system. I hope I've given it justice by explaining it that way. If I haven't, I do apologise, but I'm trying to sort of keep it relatively simple. Anyway, back to the RT3s. Another difference with the RT3s was the lack of a rear roof box for the route number. They'd fallen into disuse, and following the experiments with RT110, which I mentioned earlier, which had been damaged during the war, London Transport decided to also get rid of the front mounted roof box number displays. But by the time London Transport had made this decision to abandon the roof boxes, the first of the post-war buses had been built with them. Both the Weyman and the Park Royal bodywork on the RT3s were jig built. This resulted in the bodywork being virtually identical, with lots of interchangeable components. Now, these buses should have been due from March 1946. But at that point, there was still a huge shortage of materials, manpower, and special tools following the war. The first of the RT3 type arrived at Chiswick Works on the 28th of April 1947, and this was Weyman-bodied RT402. This was followed on the 12th of May by Park Royal-bodied RT152. Further orders were placed with both Park Royal and Weyman, and indeed the next 250 of these carried the outdated front roof box. However, from Park Royal bodied RT852 and Weyman bodied RT1012, the roof box was omitted. These non-roof box RTs entering service in October 1948. Starting from RT1678, which was bodied by Park Royal, and Weyman bodied RT3115 in March-April 1950, the cream upper deck window surround was omitted on the RT class buses. At this time, London Transport was proposing to introduce spray painting, and they needed to simplify the livery layout, which required less masking and obviously less manpower. In the middle of 1950, a batch of 36 Weyman-bodied RTs, which was RT3224 to 3259, arrived and were carrying the Green Line livery. And they looked very smart with the raised London Transport bullseye between the decks and a pale green central waistband. As with all Green Line coaches, they didn't feature any adverts and were put to use on a busy route into Aldgate from Romford. Now in 1950 there was also RT type buses with Park Royal bodywork to the London Transport body design that were delivered to St Helens Corporation, but again I will deal with these in a future video, and the same with the ones that were delivered to Coventry Corporation in 1951. I'm only mentioning them here in case you think, well, he's just missed them out completely, hasn't he? But I haven't. That same year, 1950, would see the contracts with the bodywork builders Park Royal and Weyman being renegotiated, and this would end up with a 2-year notice of termination from either side, London Transport or the bodybuilders. By 1952 there was a drop in passenger figures, and London Transport could see that it would end up with more RT buses than it actually needed. So it gave notice to the bodybuilders that it wanted them to stop building the buses. However, due to this 2-year clause that had been put into the new contract, that the last of the type was delivered. The final bus to be delivered was RT4794, which was a Weyman-bodied one delivered on the 11th of November 1954. However, the numerical last bus, which was RT4825, which was Park Royal bodied, had entered service on the 29th of March 1954. There had been 5,450 identical RT and RTL type bodies for London Transport. But of course by this time the Routemaster was already in the wings, and the RT was, to be fair, already obsolete. 144 brand new RTs and the Leyland RTLs were put into store for several years, with the last one entering service in August 1959, and this was RT4773. Now we've looked at the Park Royal and we've looked at the Weyman RTs, but there were a couple of other bodybuilders that got involved with the production of the RT class buses, and that was Saunders of Anglesey and Craven of Sheffield. Now Metro Camel and Leyland also built on the RT class buses, but these were the RTLs, and as I've said before, I will deal with those in a separate video, as we are purely talking about the AEC Regent III RT class bus. The Saunders bodywork was pretty much identical to the Park Royal and Weyman bodied RT bodywork, from the outside anyway. One minor difference was that the offside route stencil fitting was in the middle of the staircase panel and not next to the window as it was on the other buses. However, under the skin it was a totally different bus, and there was only about 50% of the bodywork that shared standard RT parts. Despite this, it was totally interchangeable with the Weyman and the Park Royal bodywork, and could be swapped around at overhaul. Saunders built a total of 300 RT bodies over 2 batches. The first batch was for 250, and Saunders had hoped to have another order for another 250 vehicles, but by this point London Transport's severe vehicle shortage was over, and all they would receive is a token offering of 50 additional bodies. The Craven bodywork, though, was totally different to the other 3 bodybuilders' offerings. The most obvious visual difference with the Craven bodied RTs was that the windows were smaller and they had more windows per side than the standard RT bodywork. Now I don't know about you, but it always makes them look slightly longer than the standard RT too. And I must admit, when I first saw these as a child, I thought they were actually stretched RTs. The upper deck bodywork was slightly squarer and more dated in appearance to the sleek lines of the original RT design bodywork. And it didn't taper in at the front end either, which resulted in a bit of a mismatch with the cab and the upper deck panelling, and looked slightly untidy, to be fair. Meanwhile, it would seem that all the curves that they had removed from the front of the upper deck had been put towards the rear of the upper deck, as this was certainly more curvaceous than on a normal RT body. The Craven bodywork wasn't interchangeable with the other bodies either. The first Craven's RTs arrived on the 22nd of September 1948, and the last one, which was RT 1521, entered service in April 1950. However, the first Craven's RTs to be withdrawn was on the 1st of June 1955, when they were just barely 5 years old. At the end of 1955, only 87 of the original 120 Craven's bodied RTs were still in service. Now, where have I heard this sort of thing happening before? It kind of sounds like the DMS saga, doesn't it? The last of the central area red Craven bodied RTs were withdrawn on the 26th of April 1956, and by the 17th of October 1956, the last of the green country area Craven bodied RTs had also been withdrawn. Bar one that had been de-roofed in a low bridge accident, all 119 operational buses were sold between April 1956 and May 1957 to dealers, and these found their way into various operating fleets and were still in service into the late 1960s and in some cases into the early 1970s. Both the Saunders and the Craven RTs were built with roof boxes. Now, there is one other variety of the RT class, which was the SRT, which would see brand new RT type bodywork fitted to 1930s AEC Regent STL type chassis. Now, you know what I'm going to say, so let's say it all together. I will be doing a video on this at a later date, as they all have a rather worthy story and it's worth doing a video on their own account. There can be few arguments against the fact that the RT class AEC Regent III in London was a huge success. They operated on all kinds of red central London routes as well as the green country area routes, as well as various Green Line services. There had been a total of 6,956 members of the RT family built, and this included the RTL and the RTWs. Now, with the arrival of the Routemaster, it should be the end of the story of the RT. But originally the Routemaster was designed to replace the trolley buses in London. And when the last Routemaster was delivered in 1968, there was still just over 3,600 RTs operating in London that would need to be replaced. By this time, though, London Transport was starting to reduce its services and look into the benefits of one-person operated buses. And at this point, London Transport was confident that the last RTs would be withdrawn by 1975. But at the time, these newer buses, and I'm talking about the Fleet Lines, the Swifts and the Merlins rather than the Routemasters, were proving to be slightly unreliable and not really fitting into the London Transport maintenance system. Coupled with the inability to get spare parts for their Routemaster fleet, this forced London Transport to do an about turn regarding the RT class buses. Now, on the 1st of January 1970, the green area of London Transport passed to the National Bus Company and became London Country. And they too had inherited a large amount of the RT class buses. And like London Transport, they envisaged getting rid of them within a few years, replacing them with one-person operated buses. Again, problems with spare parts and service reliability plagued London Country. And I have done a video on this in the past, and I will try and put a little link up in the top right hand corner to the time when London Country had to loan buses from outside of London to keep their services going. So despite London Country wanting to get rid of their buses as early as possible, the last London Country RT was in service right up until September 1978. And you can shoot me now, but I have to say there is something rather pleasing about seeing a National Bus Company leaf green RT. London Transport again was still having its problems with reliability and spare parts too, and indeed had bought back 34 RTs from London Country to try and ease the situation. And these tended to pop up in all sorts of weird and wonderful locations, some of them looking incredibly scruffy as well. In 1978, London Transport had to borrow privately owned RTs and RTLs that it had sold off for driver training duties, as there was a shortage of training buses, and the training buses that had certificates of fitnesses could then return back into service. It was not until the 7th of April 1979 that the last London Transport RT operated en route 62. At this point, the RT was 40 years old, and that is an absolute amazing age for a service bus, isn't it? If you think of today, the equivalent would be finding a Mark II Metro bus or a Eastern Coachworks Leyland Olympian still in service, just to put it in context for you. And there the RT story should end, shouldn't it? But it didn't, because many of us sold on to further use with new operators and new owners. And you'll be getting fed up with me saying this, but I will look at those new owners, the new roles and the new operators in another video. However, what I will say is, with bus preservationists and operators such as Blue Triangle and of course Enzyme Bus, the RT class buses are still a regular sight in central London and its surrounds. There are still many RTs that are class 6, which means they can be used for hire and reward and carry passengers legally. And companies such as Enzyme must be absolutely thanked and appreciated for their time and effort in restoring these fine vehicles. The Pioneer Bus RT1 also still survives with the London Bus Preservation Trust at Brooklands, even though the chassis from RT1 has long gone, and the current body that is RT1 is sitting on the chassis of RT1420. But we don't say anything about that, do we? That can be our little secret. Now, when we look at the concluding part of the RT story, which will involve, as I said before, all the second-hand owners and the new owners and the new uses they got, we will also look at those RTs that were exported to overseas territories, as that could well be a half-hour video in its own right. I hope you enjoyed this video on the RT buses, and this is so far one of my longest videos about buses. I do hope my voice hasn't sent you to sleep, and it has been really hard trying to cram all the history of the RT class buses into a half-hour long video. So please bear in mind there may well be things that I've left out, and I genuinely couldn't put everything about these fine buses in a video this length. If I have left anything out that's important to you, I do apologise, but please comment down below and let me know. Also, comment down below with your memories and your facts and trivia and your thoughts on the RT class buses. I do love reading your comments, especially about something as interesting as this. Have you ever driven an RT? Have you worked on the RTs? Or indeed a Regent III of any kind? Or did you indeed preserve one? Again, thank you so very much for watching. I'm going to go for a lay down in a dark room. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you will receive a little notification when I do the follow-up video to this mammoth episode. All money raised by this YouTube channel goes towards the upkeep and continued restoration of the Southern Counties Omnibus Collection buses. So by watching this video about old RTs, you're helping Bristol VRTs, which is brilliant, isn't it? Thanks ever so much for watching. Bye for now.